In the blistering heat of July 1889, beneath a sky that bled rust and gold across the West Texas horizon, a lone figure trudged down a forgotten dirt path between scorched mesquite trees and the hushed, ghostly silence of dry fields. Father Ezra King, a traveling priest of weary soul and sun-darkened skin, clutched his leather satchel close, its worn strap cutting into his shoulder as he searched the land for any sign of shelter before dusk fell entirely. He had been walking for hours, his mule having collapsed 3 days prior near the Llano River, and though his faith had carried him through hunger, rattlesnake sightings, and nights spent beneath shrieking coyotes, he knew his body would soon give out. That's when he saw it, a crooked chimney peeking over a rise, its brickwork blackened as if it had once been licked by fire. As he crested the hill, the old Yates farmhouse emerged from the dying light. A sagging, weather-beaten structure standing alone at the edge of the prairie, its whitewash flaking off like old skin, windows fogged with age, and its porch listing forward as if bowing to some unseen weight. The air turned strange here, heavier, and Ezra, a man who had walked into war hospitals, cholera camps, and Indian raids, felt an unfamiliar chill crawl up his spine. Still, necessity overrode unease. He stepped onto the porch, boots thudding softly on worm-eaten wood, and rapped twice on the front door. No answer. He waited, knocked again. Nothing. The wind stirred, and with it came a scent that turned his stomach, sweet, metallic, and rotten. Compelled by both fear and duty, he pushed open the unlocked door and entered. The stench hit him like a blow. Inside, dust hung in the air like smoke, catching the orange light of the setting sun that poured in through the warped slats of the boarded windows. The room was still, too still. A table sat in the center of the kitchen, set for 5. Plates of food remained untouched, hardened biscuits, mashed sweet potatoes, slices of cured ham, all crawling with bluebottles. A pitcher of milk had curdled in the heat, and the air buzzed with the furious wings of flies. Ezra stepped closer, eyes narrowing. The table hadn't been cleared. Nothing had been moved. It was as if the family had simply stood up mid-meal and vanished. Then he saw it. A single sheet of paper placed gently beside a rusted spoon, its edges smudged with small fingerprints and sticky rings of grape jelly. The note was scrawled in childish script, uneven and trembling. "Mama says not to look in the barn. I heard the crying again." Ezra read it twice. The second time, his lips moved silently, as if repeating the words gave them more power. A chill passed through him. The handwriting was unmistakably that of a young child, too young to fabricate such dread. Slowly, cautiously, he moved through the rest of the house. The parlor bore signs of recent life. Knitting needles rested beside a half-finished scarf on the arm of a rocking chair. A Bible lay open to the Book of Job. A wooden toy soldier leaned against the leg of a cabinet, forgotten in play. Yet there were no people. No Henry Yates, the preacher who had once written fire and brimstone sermons from this very home. No Margaret Yates, known for her quiet warmth and even quieter sadness. No children's laughter echoing through the rooms. Upstairs, the bedrooms were in order, but dust had begun to settle on the beds as if they had not been disturbed in days. A doll lay face down on one child's pillow, its porcelain hands smeared with what looked like dirt, or something darker. Ezra found no blood, no struggle, no bodies, only silence, and that terrible smell. It came strongest from the kitchen floor, where beneath a ragged throw rug he discovered a trap door, latched shut with a right, usted iron hook. He stared at it, pulse quickening, until a creak behind him made him spin. The house had no wind strong enough to move doors. The front door now sat wide open, though he had closed it. He stepped back into the hallway, heart pounding. Something felt wrong. Not merely abandoned, but violated, desecrated, like a church where something unholy had taken residence. Leaving the trapdoor undisturbed for now, he returned to the front room, crossed himself, and stepped back out into the fading light. That's when he looked toward the barn. It stood about 30 yards from the house, a squat structure wrapped in vines and shadows, its wide doors chained shut and sealed with a heavy iron padlock. On its faded wooden surface, someone had crudely carved a symbol Ezra did not recognize, a jagged spiral enclosed by 7 short lines, like rays of a sun, but reversed. He approached cautiously, boots crunching on brittle grass. The barn radiated cold. The hair on his arms prickled. He reached out to touch the padlock and stopped. From within, so faint he almost dismissed it, came the sound of weeping. Not loud, not human, a slow, wet sobbing, like something trying to mimic sorrow. Ezra stumbled back, tripping over a root, his satchel thudding to the ground. He wanted to flee, to put miles between himself and whatever had taken hold of this God-forsaken place. But the note in the child's hand burned in his memory. And he was a priest. He could not simply walk away, not without trying to understand, not without trying to pray. He returned to the house, lit a candle from the hearth with shaking hands, and descended into the cellar. The air grew cold and damp as he stepped down the stairs, candlelight casting long shadows on the stone walls. It was a simple space, a stone floor, shelves lined with jars of preserves and sacks of flour. But at the far end was something unexpected. A narrow, jagged tunnel carved into the dirt, sloping down into darkness. This had not been made for storage. Ezra hesitated, then moaned. Feed. Closer. The walls of the tunnel were marked with scratches, fingernail deep, and symbols similar to the one on the barn door. He called out, "Is anyone down there?" His voice echoed, then was swallowed by silence. And then he heard it, like a whisper pressed directly to his ear. "Help us." He dropped the candle. It sputtered and went out. For a moment, the darkness around him pulsed with the sound of breathing. Many breathings. He turned and fled, scrambled up the stairs, slammed the trapdoor shut, and sat against it, panting, heart pounding in his throat. When dawn finally broke, casting pale gold over the ruins of the Yates property, Father Ezra King did not speak. Not for 3 days. When he finally reached the nearest town, clothes torn and eyes hollow, he told the sheriff what he had seen. The sheriff rode out with 6 men, but when they arrived, the house had burned to the ground. Not a smolder, not an ember, just ash, as though it had been consumed from the inside. The barn remained, untouched, but the chains were broken. Inside they found no livestock, no tools, only claw marks on the ceiling. The case was never solved. The Yates family was never seen again, and the note, the child's desperate warning, remains prémé. In the years before the Yates farmhouse fell into ruin and legend, before Father Ezra King ever laid eyes on that rotting porch or the bone-chilling trapdoor beneath the kitchen floor, the land was silent, but not dead. It watched. It listened. And, most unsettling to those few neighbors who dared linger on the edge of the Yates property, it whispered. The Yates family arrived in 1883 with little fanfare and less baggage, settling into the worn homestead left to Henry Yates as by a cousin who had died suddenly and without heirs, though some would later say he died under stranger circumstances that the family refused to name. Henry Yates, a man forged by the horrors of the Civil War and broken by the demons it left behind, had once been a passionate preacher who thundered from pulpits about fire, damnation, and the righteous path of God. But something had shifted after the war, after Antietam, after whatever he'd seen in those bloody fields and the desecrated chapels of fallen towns. He spoke less and often now, choosing instead to isolate himself with his quiet wife Margaret, who, before marriage, had taught Latin and Greek in a small girls' seminary, and their 4 children. Anna, a bookish girl with hollow eyes who rarely blinked. Thomas, who was mute by choice, some claimed, but who always seemed to be listening to things no one else could hear. Caleb, a boy with a sharp laugh and sharper nails who was never seen without a pocket knife he used to carve strange symbols into bark and bone alike. And Ruth, the youngest, barely 5 when they arrived, with a voice like glass shattering, soft, sharp, unforgettable. The townsfolk tried to welcome them. Margaret came to the general store a few times a month, polite but distant, buying salt, flour, candles, and books. Always books. Henry occasionally traveled to Fredericksburg or Mason for church supplies, but the children were almost never seen, and when they were, they kept to the shadows. Pale, thin, eyes sunken, not with illness, but as if they were focused inward. The locals began calling them the Ghost Kids, half in jest, half in truth, for there was something unchildlike about them. Their movements were too synchronized, their silences too loud. One day, a neighbor named Beulah Croft, a stern widow with a will like iron, brought a basket of bread and preserves to the Yates home, determined to check on Margaret and her brood. What she encountered unsettled her so deeply that she told no one for weeks. She found the front door open, as if expecting her. Inside, the house was too quiet. Margaret stood in the kitchen, her hands submerged in a basin of dark water, though there were no dishes in sight. Her eyes were closed. "I brought you some blackberry jam," Beulah had said, forcing cheer into her voice. Margaret nodded slowly, as if waking from a dream. "Thank you," she replied. Then, from the hallway behind her, came the sound. Whispers, low and insistent, like a conversation happening just out of reach. Beulah frowned. "Your children, are they home?" Margaret didn't turn. "They're listening," she said. "They always listen." Curious and unsettled, Beulah stepped toward the sound. As she approached the hall, the whispers sharpened, threading through her ears in a language she couldn't place. It was not Spanish, not Latin, not even German, which many settlers still spoke. It was older, hungrier, like words being pulled through mud. She turned a corner and saw them. Anna, Thomas, Caleb, and Ruth, standing shoulder to shoulder, facing a wall where a small crack ran from floor to ceiling. Their mouths were moving, not all at once, but in relay, as though reciting parts of something ancient and memorized. The crack in the wall seemed to pulse in response. Beulah's breath caught. "Children?" she said, voiced tight. 4 heads turned toward her in unison. Not fast, not slow, just unblinkingly deliberate. "He's in the cellar," Anna said. "But the wall remembers." Beulah left then, basket abandoned on the table, and she never went back. She warned others too, though always vaguely, never daring to recount what she truly saw. From that day on, rumors deepened. Some claimed the children no longer cast shadows at dusk. Others said they'd seen Caleb skinning birds and placing their organs in glass jars near the barn. One man swore he caught Thomas humming a tune near the cemetery that matched a funeral chant used in pre-Christian rituals of the Northern Isles. But perhaps most chilling of all was what happened one early morning in June 1889. A cattle rancher named Eli Smothers, while checking his herd along a shallow creek, found little Ruth Yates walking barefoot through the reeds, her nightgown soaked, and her small feet streaked with blood not her own. She stared blankly ahead, eyes glazed with something far older than fear. When Eli called her name, she turned her head slowly and whispered, "The cellar is awake." He carried her back to the farmhouse, but by the time they arrived, she had fallen asleep in his arms and would not wake. Margaret answered the door with hollow eyes and took the girl silently, offering no explanation. Later that day, the sheriff rode out to speak with Henry, but the preacher was nowhere to be found. Only Margaret answered the door again, her voice rasping like dry leaves. "He's praying," she said, "deep in the earth." The sheriff asked to speak to the children. She said they were fasting, preparing. "For what?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "The remembering." After that, no one visited again. The Yates home became a ghost on the prairie, a place that breathed but did not live. At night, ranchers would pass the edge of the property and hear voices in the wind. Not cries, not laughter, but layered speech, overlapping and recursive, like someone reciting a sermon backwards while weeping. And always, always, the walls of the house seemed to lean inward, as though listening, feeding, absorbing. In those final weeks before their disappearance, several strange events were recorded in nearby town logs. Crops near the Yates homestead withered overnight. Dogs refused to hunt near the property, and strange fungi grew in tight spirals along fence posts and trees. Birds flew in erratic patterns above the house, and on one occasion, a local boy reported seeing Anna Yates standing motionless on the roof, arms outstretched, eyes white and white with no pupils visible. When he called out to her, she simply tilted her head to the sky and opened her mouth, releasing a soundless scream that the boy claimed he heard anyway, inside his skull. A traveling merchant passing through reported seeing the children lined up outside the barn just after sunset, hands linked, facing the door. It was chained then, but even from the road, the merchant claimed he could hear something behind it, scratching, scraping like something too large for the space it occupied. And all the while, the children were murmuring, not in fear, but in reverence. The merchant did not stop his wagon, nor did he report what he saw until years later, when alcohol loosened his tongue in a saloon and the firelight made the shadows on his face twitch. Then, just days before the family vanished entirely, a woman riding past at dawn saw Ruth again, this time standing by the creek, face and arms smeared with a black, oily substance. Her eyes were open, but her pupils were gone, replaced by dull, milky discs. She was smiling. The woman turned her horse and never spoke of it, save to her husband. When the farmhouse was finally investigated, after Ezra King's panicked testimony, those who entered felt the same things he did: the wrongness in the air, the heavy silence, the undeniable pull of the cellar. But even before they found the note or opened the trap door, something else stood out. Every wall in the children's bedroom bore carvings, shallow but deliberate. Spirals, crossed circles, eyes, symbols etched with nails or knives into plaster and wood. In the corner of Anna's room, a series of handprints had been stamped in what tests later claimed was ash mixed with bone dust. Some prints were far too small, others far too large. Whatever the Yates children had been doing in those final months, it wasn't simply a game. They were practicing, preparing, repeating the whispers taught to them by a voice in the walls, a voice in the dark, a voice passed down through Henry from whatever eldritch relic he had brought back from war. And though the family vanished, though the farmhouse was reduced to cinders, and though the cellar was sealed by men too terrified to even speak of what lay beneath, some say that even now, when the wind is just right and the moon hangs low, you can hear the voices again, faint, repetitive, not begging, not warning, teaching. And always, the children's room remains the coldest place on what's left of the Yates land, the walls humming softly, as if remembering the ones who taught them to speak. Everyone in the county knew one rule about the Yates land. You never went near the barn, not during the day, not after dark, and especially not if you heard anything coming from it. It stood like a scar on the earth, low and wide, built from scorched timber that seemed to absorb light instead of reflect it. Its roof slightly slanted as though sagging under an invisible weight. Long before the events of July 1889, even before the whispers started leaking out from the house, the barn was already the source of stories that spread through the dry Texas air like pollen. Locals said it wasn't just a place to store tools or animals. It was a prison, a tomb, a lock placed over something ancient and angry, something that Henry Yates had disturbed the year he returned from the war with dead eyes and a leather satchel he never let out of his reach. It began with what Henry called the infestation. In the spring of 1886, according to Margaret's faded journal entries later uncovered in a metal box buried beneath the porch, Henry had begun hearing sounds in the barn, scraping at first, then thuds, then voices that echoed long after he stepped away. He blamed rats, coyotes, maybe even wild dogs. But traps didn't work. Poison didn't work. The sounds didn't stop. Instead, they grew more coordinated. Henry said he had once found symbols scrawled in the hayloft in what looked like dried blood, though no animal was injured, no wound discovered. Then the livestock started to die. First the chickens. Their necks snapped, but no blood spilled. Then the goats, found in a circle, entrails pulled into patterns that didn't make sense to anyone who still walked with God. Finally, their only horse was discovered by Caleb one morning, standing silent and still, as if frozen in time, its eyes milk white and mouth gaping in a scream it never had the chance to finish. Henry buried the animals behind the tombe barn in shallow graves and told no one. But something about that burial made things worse. Margaret wrote of nights when Henry would wake drenched in sweat, mumbling Latin phrases she didn't recognize, though she'd taught Latin for years. "It's not Latin," she wrote. "It only wears Latin like a skin." After one especially violent episode where Henry tore the bed sheets and bit through his own tongue, he locked himself inside the barn for 3 days, emerging with a gaunt face and the first of the chains, thick iron links wrapped around the barn doors like a wound dressed in steel. He paid old Merle Tuller, the town blacksmith, in 5 gold coins, Confederate minted, uncirculated, far too pristine for war spoils. Henry handed him a drawing and told him to forge a symbol into a thick steel plate. The blacksmith didn't ask questions. When it was finished, Henry affixed it to the barn door himself. Most said it looked like a cross, but anyone who studied it long enough could tell it wasn't Christian. It bent in ways no cross should bend. Lines looping into spirals, the ends barbed, a small, open circle at the center like an eye forever watching. After that, the noises quieted. For a time. But the whispers didn't stop. The children still gathered near the barn at dusk. They never went inside, not then, but they'd stand at the fence, hands linked, eyes closed, mouths moving in rhythm, like they were listening for a beat that no one else could hear. Some claimed the barn would breathe, its wooden slats expanding and contracting as though something massive slept just beyond the threshold. Others reported seeing the grass around it die in perfect circles, like rings left by fire that never burned. Then came the screams. It was a Sunday night, 2 days before Father Ezra stumbled upon the deserted house, and the sun had just begun to dip behind the hills, when the first scream echoed Aki. Ross the Prairie. 3 different neighbors heard it: Elijah Dunlop, whose ranch lay 2 miles east, Mabel Tighe, who lived alone with her 2 hunting dogs, and Jonah Bell, a retired surveyor with a tin ear but sharp instincts. All 3 described it the same way. Not human, not animal, but somewhere in between. A long, rolling wail that seemed to stretch across the land like a blanket soaked in fire. Elijah was the first to reach for his rifle. He rode toward the Yates property, but as he crested the ridge that overlooked their homestead, his horse reared violently and threw him. As he struggled to his feet, blood streaming from his forehead, Elijah looked down and froze. The barn doors were open. The chains lay scattered like broken bones, and the steel plate with the forged symbol now sat cracked in half on the ground, its edges blackened as if burned from within. What emerged from the barn, Elijah could not describe, not then, not ever. He would later say he saw the night step forward. He ran. Mabel, miles away, claimed she heard children laughing as the scream ended. Not joyously, not even playfully. The kind of laughter you might hear in an asylum, echoing off padded walls. Her dogs howled for hours, foaming at the mouth, and one dropped dead before morning. Jonah Bell said he didn't hear the scream with his ears, but felt it in his bones, like a tuning fork pressed against his spine. The following morning, when the sheriff was finally called and dared to investigate, he found the barn door swaying in the wind, its hinges creaking like dying lungs. Inside there was nothing but dust and darkness, no blood, no signs of life, no animals, no tools, just claw marks, hundreds of them. On the beams, on the rafters, on the inside of the doors. Some human-sized, some not. Some curved in impossible arcs, like whatever had made them had too many joints, too many fingers. The sheriff didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, he simply muttered, "It was trying to get out, or keep something in." The Yates family was never seen again after that night. No bodies were found. No footprints led away from the barn or the house. But the whispering in the wind grew louder in the days that followed. And some say the prairie itself began to change. Trees near the property bent in one direction, as if leaning away. Birds flew wider circles to avoid the barn. Grass no longer grew within 100 yards of the site. Locals took it upon themselves to seal it again. New chains, new padlocks. A new symbol, this time carved by a preacher, a rabbi, and a medicine woman in an attempt to cover all their bases. But none dared enter again. The barn was left to rot under the Texas sun, though rot never came. It remained whole, silent, watchful. Some years later, a traveling researcher from New Orleans passed through and insisted on seeing the Yates property. He claimed to be studying American occult architecture and had heard whispers of the barn and its unholy geometry. He took measurements, photographs, spent the night alone in a tent just outside the barn. When morning came, he was gone. His tent stood untouched. His journal, left open, contained only one phrase written over and over again. "The door is a mouth." To this day, no one builds on the land, no one plows it, no one grazes cattle near it. The barn still stands, though weather has tried to tear it down. Storms roll in, but the lightning never strikes it. Wind howls, but the dust never settles on it. And at sundown, if you stand too close, if your heart dares beat fast enough, you might hear it breathe. And if you listen too long, you might begin to understand the whispers. You might begin to repeat them. And if you do, the barn might open its mouth for you too. It wasn't until the spring of 1942, more than 5 decades after the Yates family disappeared from the face of the earth, that the earth itself began to speak, cracking open with the force of drought and memory, exposing what had long been buried under layers of superstition, scorched soil, and the thick silence of collective denial. The hill country was suffering that year. Crops failed. Wells dried. Horses stumbled mid-gait with their tongues lolling from their mouths. Eyes rolled white. In the town of Llano, old-timers muttered about how the land was remembering, though few dared say what they meant. The Yates property, untouched and unsold for over 50 years, remained fenced off with rusting wire and 2 nailed signs that read, "Do not trespass," and "God is not here." No one farmed the land. No children played there. The barn still stood, cracked and grayed by time but not broken, its strange symbol etched into the warped door with something stronger than iron. But it wasn't the barn that gave way first. It was the house, or what was left of it. What little remained of the Yates homestead had long since collapsed into a pile of brick and charred foundation, its memory surviving only in the whispers of local folklore and the nightmares of those foolish enough to venture near. But during the third week of May, after months of blistering heat and no rain, a tremor split the northern corner of the property and revealed the edge of something hard buried in the dry earth. A rusted iron box, barely the size of a toolbox, wrapped in strips of rotting cloth and bound with twine blackened by age and mold. It was discovered by a state geologist named Raymond Phelps, who had been sent to survey the land for mineral deposits. He hadn't even known the name Yates until a rancher nearby shook his head and told him not to dig there. "Nothing good comes up from that soil," the old head man warned. "They planted something that wasn't meant to grow." But curiosity is a kind of sickness, and Phelps, being a rational man, laughed it off. He opened the box the same day. Inside, wrapped in brittle fabric and flakes of dried lavender, was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and clinging together like dead leaves in a storm. It smelled of mold and ash. Embossed into the cover, nearly invisible, were the initials M.Y., Margaret Yates. The writing inside began plainly enough. Descriptions of daily life on the farm, musings about the children, Anna's refusal to eat meat, Thomas's inability to speak in public, Caleb's obsessions with sharp things, and Ruth's vivid dreams of the upside-down man who lives in the chimney. Margaret wrote with restraint, as though aware that someone some day might read her words. The early pages reflected the image the town had constructed of her: quiet, educated, motherly, private. But as the entries continued, the tone changed. The language decayed. Sanity began to unravel thread by thread, like a dress losing its seams in the wind. She wrote of Henry and his return from the war, not just changed, but altered, not immediately. At first, he was simply quiet, like many men who had seen death at close range. But then, one day in the summer of 1884, she wrote, "He brought home something wrapped in oilcloth, kept hidden in the cellar, and refused to speak of it for weeks." When Margaret confronted him, he broke down, not in grief or guilt, but in ecstasy. He called it a revelation, a gift from the battlefield, something he found on a Confederate corpse whose body had not decayed, even after lying exposed for months. The object was a book, bound in what Henry claimed was pigskin. Margaret would later write that she knew from the first moment it was not pigskin. The texture, the pores, the faint outline of what looked like a human nipple near the spine of the cover, these were not the marks of livestock. Henry called it the voice of the deep. At first, she thought he was being metaphorical, poetic even, but then the changes began. He stopped praying aloud. He refused to attend church. He began speaking to the children in whispers she could not hear from the doorway, but that made them go silent afterward for hours. One night, she awoke to find him standing over Ruth's crib, his eyes rolled back in his head, murmuring in a language that slithered like oil across the floorboards. When she screamed, he turned to her and asked, not in anger, but in genuine confusion, "Why did you wake me?" That night, she wrote, she burned the oilcloth and hid the book in a locked chest, but by morning it was gone. Henry had it again, and when she asked how, he simply smiled and said, "You can't bury a voice, Margaret. It knows its name. The diary grew darker. Margaret detailed how the children began to draw the same symbols over and over. Spirals within circles, eyes without pupils, doors shaped like mouths, hands reaching downward instead of upward. Caleb began carrying around the carcasses of small animals, collecting bones for his tower. Thomas began to sleepwalk, often waking in the barn even though it was chained. Anna wrote in a language Margaret didn't recognize and claimed she heard the footsteps inside the walls. Ruth stopped speaking altogether but began mimicking others perfectly, even repeating things no one had said aloud. Margaret confessed her terror in plain words. "They are not my children anymore." One entry, dated October 3rd, 1888, told of the cellar's awakening. Henry had taken to praying in the root cellar, at first alone, then with the children. Margaret would hear them chant, hour after hour, their voices harmonizing in unnatural rhythms, rising and falling like a tide. She wrote of shadows that didn't match the shapes of bodies, of hearing the same phrase whispered from different rooms at the same time. Feed the root, wake the root, be the root. On November 11th, she wrote the words, "Henry's voice has changed. It isn't his anymore." That same night, she claimed she saw the cellar door breathing, wood expanding and contracting as if inhaling. She tried to burn it. The fire refused to catch. That was when she realized. The thing in the cellar wasn't in the wood. It was beneath it. In the final weeks of entries, Margaret deteriorated. Her handwriting became shaky, fragmented. The sentences incomplete. She described the barn chains rattling on their own. Ruth began drawing upside-down crosses in ash on her arms. Caleb claimed the man in the book had promised to make them gods. Thomas carved the word return into his chest. Anna stopped blinking entirely and began reciting the family's names in reverse, over and over, until Margaret vomited blood from the sheer horror of it. In one of the last entries, Margaret wrote, "I tried to smother Ruth in her sleep. I failed. Her eyes opened, and she said, 'It's not your time yet, Mother.'" Then came the final page. It was dated July 3rd, 1889. The handwriting was smaller than the others, as if she feared someone, something, might be reading over her shoulder. The ink was faded but legible. "Henry is gone, not dead, just gone. He walked into the barn during the second red moon and disappeared. The children watched. They smiled. They said he was going home. Last night I heard singing beneath the house. Not voices, not even sound, more like hunger. I opened the cellar. I thought I could throw the book inside and seal it forever, but I dropped it. It opened, and something came out. I didn't see it, but I felt it brush past me. It was wet, and cold, and endless. The children say it lives in us now. I don't know if I believe in God anymore, but if He is still watching, I ask only one thing. Please let them forget." The page ended with what looked like an attempt to write more, but the ink had Samiate, red, and the pressure of the pen cut through the page. Raymond Phelps, the geologist who discovered the diary, delivered it to the Llano County Historical Society, where it was promptly locked in a vault and never displayed. The archivist who first read it resigned within the month. Years later, Phelps disappeared while hiking alone in Big Bend, leaving only a page from the diary folded in his boot. That page contained the repeated phrase, "It speaks through dirt." Since the diary's discovery, those few who have read it describe hearing Margaret's voice in their sleep, always faint, always behind a wall, always whispering warnings too late to matter. The Yates mystery, long considered rural folklore, gained new weight with the emergence of the diary. No longer dismissed as a ghost story, the events were quietly acknowledged by fringe historians and occult researchers, some of whom now believe Henry Yates did not find the book by accident. Some say he was chosen. Others believe the Confederate corpse he found it on was placed there by something older. But what all agree on is this: The Voice of the Deep was not a book in the traditional sense. It was a key. And Margaret, for all her suffering, had tried to keep the door closed. Her diary was not a confession. It was a warning. And now that it had been read, the whispering had started again. Long before the book found its way into the trembling hands of Henry Yates, before its warped leather binding whispered promises to a broken man wandering through the blood-drenched fields of Antietam, the Voice of the Deep had passed through centuries like a plague wearing paper skin, surviving fire, exile, burial, and memory, always reappearing in the hands of those desperate enough to listen and foolish enough to believe that what they heard was meant for them. In 1963, a forgotten scrap of the book surfaced in the moldy attic of an abandoned asylum near Texarkana, discovered by a fringe paranormal historian named Warren Chisholm, whose obsession with geotheological disturbances had led him across the dusty backroads of Texas in search of proof that evil was not only real, but transcribed. The page had been carefully preserved between two panes of glass, etched with symbols that did not belong to any known language, but which carried an uncomfortable rhythm to them, as if the marks themselves hummed when stared at too long. Linguists failed to translate it, though one Eastern European scholar claimed the shapes mirrored glyphs associated with a 14th century heretical sect called Dei sub terra, God beneath the earth, a forbidden cult that was erased from ecclesiastical records after its members were burned alive in the Carpathian Mountains for allegedly offering children to the hunger beneath the hills. That scholar, Dr. Marek Lichten, vanished in 1965 after writing only one line in a private letter. It is not a language, it is an invitation. But long before Chisholm or Lichten or the archivists who went mad trying to replicate the page's patterns, the book had already spoken to Henry Yates. According to the entries in Margaret's diary and fragments of local oral history, Henry discovered the book in late 1864 while looting the battlefield remains of a Shatai, a Red Confederate platoon outside Sharpsburg. He claimed the corpse he took it from, still warm, unrotted, eyes open, had a smile carved into its face and a sigil burned into its chest that matched no known insignia. The book was bound in leathery flesh, the texture disturbingly human, with its pages etched not in ink, but a brownish substance that flaked when touched and left a metallic scent on the fingers. Henry, already frayed by war, illness, and guilt, took it without understanding why. He later told Margaret that when he opened the first page, he didn't read it, he heard it. It spoke directly to him in a voice that was not his own, yet somehow came from inside his chest, a resonance in the bones that made his mouth move without permission. At first, he resisted. For weeks he buried the book beneath his cot, tried to forget it, even considered burning it. But something about the weight of it, the heat it seemed to emit when he lay near it, compelled him to keep it. Over time, he began to read aloud. Not in public, not in daylight. Always at night, alone in the woods, the sound of his voice mingling with the wind until he began to feel the response. First, in small things. A dying tree that bloomed overnight, a wounded rabbit that blinked and ran away, the fever that had gripped his limbs for weeks suddenly breaking as if erased by unseen hands. But the miracles were never free. Henry began to hear noises beneath the ground. Muffled knocking, tremors, distant moans like a mountain grinding its teeth. His dreams turned red. And when he returned home after the war, after years of carrying the book hidden under his shirt like a second heart, he spoke less of God and more of what listens. Margaret, devoted but wary, recorded these shifts without fully understanding them until the changes became too clear to ignore. The crops on the Yates farm thrived even in drought. The W.L., dry for years, overflowed. The children no longer got sick. Even Caleb, who had nearly died of diphtheria, stood up one morning without a cough, smiling strangely. But as the harvests grew richer, the house grew colder. Time bent. Ruth stopped aging. Neighbors noticed the children always looked the same, thin, pale, wide-eyed, as if whatever lived in them had decided growth was unnecessary. The book, meanwhile, had become an altar. Henry no longer read from it. He prayed to it, reciting passages in the barn before dawn, marking symbols on the floor with bone ash and goat's blood. Margaret once caught him whispering into a hole in the earth, voice shaking with reverence, "I offer you the ones I made." She didn't understand the meaning then. She would. The rituals began small. Dead birds laid at the cellar door, coins arranged in star shapes on the floor, salt circles around the children's beds. But by 1887 the sacrifices escalated. The dog disappeared. Then a neighbor's calf. Then silence fell over the entire farm between sundown and sunup. No noise, no lanterns, not even footsteps. Just stillness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Margaret, who had once played piano hymns every morning, now scribbled scripture backwards into the margins of her cookbooks, trying to unravel the knots of language Henry used when he spoke to the book. But the children already knew them. One night, Anna repeated a phrase Henry had said only in the barn, behind locked doors. "Be hollow, be filled." When Margaret asked her what it meant, Anna's pupils dilated until her eyes were nothing but black, and she replied, "The book feeds us now. We don't eat your food anymore." The deeper truth of the voice of the deep was not that it simply offered power, it offered permission. Permission to unlock the veil between flesh and soil, to whisper into the cracks of the world and have something ancient whisper back. Henry came to believe that the earth was alive in a way man had long forgotten, that beneath the crust and rock and bone of this world lay an intelligence older than time, a hunger not born from malice, but design. The book was its mouthpiece, its will engraved in pages that shimmered when held to fire, but screamed when burned. And so he fed it, not because he hated his family, but because he believed he was saving them. "It told me," he wrote in the margins of a sermon that was later found buried in a jar behind the barn, "that the soul is a debt, that the blood in our veins is borrowed. I am only returning what was never ours." Locals would later whisper that the Yates children did not die. They were taken, not kidnapped, not murdered, offered, given like candles into a pit, each flame extinguished in exchange for something Henry believed would spare his own soul. And perhaps, in a twisted way, it did, for no trace of his body was ever found. Only the book, left open on the cellar floor the day Father Ezra discovered the house, its pages fluttering without wind, its ink fresh as if it had just been written. Some said the book had claimed him. Others claimed he had finally stepped into it. In the decades that followed, the book resurfaced only once, in '94, when a collector of antique Bibles named Raymond Doyle received an anonymous package containing 3 pages wrapped in butcher's paper and sealed with a symbol resembling the one on the Yates barn door. Doyle studied the pages for a year. He went blind. Not from injury, not from illness. His retinas turned to glass. His final message, recorded by a nurse in a care facility in Austin, was a whispered phrase repeated for hours. It's still listening. It remembers every word. Today, the voice of the deep remains one of the most feared and contested relics in North American occult history. Some deny its existence entirely, calling it a myth invented by traumatized survivors. Others claim it is hidden in the vaults of private collectors or buried beneath churches, built over ancient fault lines.
But among those who study what they call linguistic contagions, words that alter reality through structure and sound, the Yates manuscript remains a cornerstone of forbidden knowledge. It is not merely a book, they say, it is a key, a map, a hunger. And those who read it never read it alone. They are watched, whispered to, measured. And when the last page is turned, it is not the reader who finishes the book, but the book that finishes the reader. In the shadow of what happened to the Yates family, some researchers have tried to find the rest of the pages, believing that if the full text is assembled, it may be possible to reverse what Henry Yates did. But others argue that the ritual is already complete, that the Yates children were only the beginning, that the door beneath the cellar was not a metaphor, but a design, and that somewhere, deep in the stone-black hollows of this wounded earth, something remembers their names, not with affection, not with malice, but with hunger. And someday, when the right words are spoken again, it will answer, "Today, the land where the Yates farmhouse once stood is no longer called by name. It is simply referred to in whispers, or not at all, because the people who live near it have learned over generations that to speak of a wound is to invite it to bleed again. The coordinates are still listed in faded county records, technically unowned but unofficially condemned, a narrow wedge of drought-blasted pastureland where the grass does not grow and even the wind avoids turning. Where once stood a modest clapboard house and a worn wooden barn, now there is only dust, broken fences, a scorched black cross planted by some forgotten hand, and a depression in the earth where the foundation of the home used to be. But beneath that depression, beneath layers of red clay, cracked limestone, and the silence of 134 years, still lies the cellar door. The same door Margaret Yates opened on her final night. The same door that would not burn. The same door that, according to those who've dared draw near it, sometimes breathes. In the years following the fire of 1891, when a group of townsfolk, gripped by terror after a rash of livestock mutilations and strange nighttime singing in the hills, doused the house in kerosene and set it aflame, people believed the Yates story was over. The family had vanished. The land was abandoned. Let the past rot under ash. But the cellar, made of stone and mortar and something else that had no name in English, did not collapse with the fire. The wooden entrance burned, yes, but beneath it the trapdoor remained, iron-banded and etched with the spiral eye sigil Henry Yates had carved into everything by the end. It resisted picks. It resisted fire. In 1931, the Texas State Geological Survey sent 2 men to investigate rumors of strange mineral patterns in the area. They reported strange magnetic fields and anomalies in soil density. One of them, Dr. Alan Muir, took a cracked, breathing. In 1987, a team of university folklorists camped half a mile from the site to study local legends. On the 3rd night, 2 graduate students reported a child's voice calling from the trees, "Mama says it's time to wake up now." When they approached the clearing, one of them claimed the ground beneath her feet pulsed like a heartbeat. They both fled. The lead professor found them the next morning, unable to speak and covered in hand-drawn spirals in ink that had not yet dried. They had no memory of drawing them. In the years that followed, those who remembered the Yates name began to die out. The town moved on. The road that once led to the farm is now overgrown, though a rusted gate still hangs there, barely visible beneath the thorns. The barn, half collapsed and tilting westward, still hums at dusk, too low to be heard by ear, but always enough to unsettle the birds. The stone cellar, however, is as intact as ever, a perfect rectangle, sealed shut, its cracks lined with moss that never spreads, its hinges fused not by rust, but by something deeper, something waiting. Modern satellite scans of the area reveal a void beneath it, a chamber perhaps 10 feet wide, deeper than expected, colder than surrounding rock. No passage leads to it, no tunnel, no ventilation. Yet on certain nights, especially when the wind dies and the stars seem unusually sharp in the sky, some claim they've heard crying. A child's cry, then another, then laughter, then silence. Some say those are just the ghosts of the Yates children. Others say they never died at all. That whatever Henry Yates unlocked in his desperation didn't kill them, it kept them, preserved them in some endless repetition of the final rite, feeding off their names, their memories, their breath. If you believe the legends, then you believe the cellar is not a room, but a ritual, not a place, but a sentence, Spo.